we're still in Ecclesiastes, so we got all pumped up to get some despair, some futility. I love Ecclesiastes. Even though it seems quite depressing, there's every time I read Ecclesiastes and whatever Bible, phone, whatever, every time it says under the sun, I highlight it because if you're not thinking about that Solomon is talking about everything under the sun, everything here on this earth, if you're not thinking about it that way, then yeah, it can be depressing. So today we're going to talk about some more stuff under the sun. We were in men's Bible study one Tuesday night a couple years ago, and Greg Jessup was in there, and he asked the group of us if you could tell somebody or teach or preach out of one book of the Bible, what would it be? And, a couple people said Romans, and I think I said at the time 1 John, because that was what I was reading, and there was some good stuff in there. We finally got back around to Greg, and he said Ecclesiastes. Everybody was kind of like, wow. And the whole purpose of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, the preacher, right, says the whole purpose of it is to spare future generations the bitterness of learning through their own experience that life apart from God is meaningless. So to be able to show people that no matter what you do under the sun, that apart from God, all of it is pointless, futility, right? And to be able to point people to that once they get to the end of their despair and think about their life and what's the meaning of life, what's the purpose of life, why am I doing what I'm doing? They ain't got no choice but what? Turn toward God in most cases. That was why it was his favorite book, and I never forgot that. But we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 today. Verses 7 through 13. Keep in mind, like I said, Solomon is talking about everything under the sun. So almost, if you were to think about life without God, and it was just what we have here on earth. So keep that in mind. Let's read it. I'm going to read it through, and then we'll talk about it. But before I get carried away, I'd love to pray. All right? God, thank you for the rain. Thank you for the sunshine. Thank you for your creation and everything under the sun that you give us to point to you, dear Lord, to point to your authorship of this life. And dear Lord, thank you that you gave us Jesus and that we don't have to be bound to just what's here on earth, and that we have eternal glory and hope that keeps us going, dear Lord. I pray that today that we would just hear you and see you. Help us to open our hearts and minds and eyes and ears to what you're seeing and doing, dear Lord. And dear Lord, I just pray that we don't miss what you're doing. We just worship our way through it. I love you. Amen. All right. Ecclesiastes 4, 7 through 13. I'm reading out a New Living Translation if it's a little bit different than yours. Verse 7 says, I observed yet another example of something meaningless under the sun. This is the case of a man who is all alone, without a child or a brother, yet works hard to gain as much wealth as he can. But then he asks himself, who am I working for? Why am I giving up so much pleasure now? It's all so meaningless and depressing. Two people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Likewise, two people lying close together can keep each other warm. But how can one be warm alone? A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back and conquer. Three are even better, for a triple-braided cord is not easily broken. It is better to be a poor but wise youth than an old foolish king who refuses all advice. Verse 7 says, Yet I observed another example of something meaningless under the sun. Like I said, Solomon is almost, if you read through the whole book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, through chapter 3 last week, for example, he is talking about despair and futility and meaninglessness, pointlessness, and it's kind of depressing, right? I think Bobby even mentioned a couple times, after a while of reading that, you're like, Lord, I need something hopeful, And Solomon almost kind of gives us a little bit of hope at the end of chapter 3, and he says, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, since there is a time for every activity and every work, if you remember that. And he gives you a little bit of hope, but then he goes right back into observing these things under the sun. Solomon acknowledges that there is God, but he's saying, let's take God out of it, for example, and just look at what is here on earth, under the sun. So he's observing some more examples to give you. Verse 8, the case of man who is all alone, without a child or a brother, and he works hard to gain as much wealth as he can, but he asks himself, who am I working for? Why am I giving up so much pleasure now? It is also meaningless and depressing. In verse 4, chapter 4, it kind of is a reference to verse 8. In verse 4, he says, I observe that most people are motivated to success because they envy their neighbors. But this too is meaningless, like chasing the wind. What do you get for being wealthy and successful? Guess what you get? Envious neighbors. That's why Solomon says it's like chasing the wind. You can work as hard as you want to and have all the success and wealth in the world, and guess what you're going to get? People jealous of you. I'm sure you've heard the expression, you must not be doing something right if people ain't talking about you. The case of the man who is all alone. The title of the message is Better Together, and I'm sure you can infer why. A man who is all alone, who even has all the wealth and success. It's meaningless, pointless, even depressing. Who are you working for? That's what he asks in the second half of the verse. Who am I working for? Why am I giving up so much pleasure now? What are you working for? You ever ask yourself that? Why am I doing what I'm doing? What's the purpose of it? Whether you know it or not, everybody's a slave to something. On Wednesday nights, we just started going through the book of James, and James starts the letter with, I'm a slave of God and of Christ Jesus. And James is Jesus' half-brother who didn't believe in Jesus while he was here on earth. It wasn't until the resurrection that he believed Jesus was who he says he is. And a lot of people, I used to have a problem with that word slave just because of the connotations it's carried in the past. And then I realized, thinking about my brother, if my brother was Jesus, for me, Jesus would have to be exactly who he says he is, and I would have to 100% believe to call myself a slave of my own half-brother. Everybody's a slave to something, whether you realize it or not. I hope today you'll ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? What's the purpose of it? Because if you don't, you might end up like Solomon. At the end of your life, looking back and going, man, I wasted a lot of time. What's your idol? Everybody idolizes something, whether you know it or not. And most of the time, if you don't know, just look at where you spend your time and your energy and your money. And a lot of times that'll point to what you worship. Maybe it's success or gaining more wealth, and you'll just get people talking about you. It's also meaningless and depressing. Proverbs 27:20, I think helps understand why It never fulfills you. Why? There's never any contentment. Proverbs 27:20 says, just as death and destruction are never satisfied, so human desire is never satisfied. Can somebody name me one person that's content, truly content, under the sun? People try to sell you on contentness, don't they? Like Matthew McConaughey tried to sell you a Lincoln. And make you feel like this is the car I need. This is going to make me happy, more content. And then you get it, and you realize once them payments start coming, that it didn't make you feel good as you thought, did it? I went to go see Mr. Robert Hudson one day this week, and a lot of times we sit out in his wood shop, and he tells me stories, and we were talking about trucks and how expensive they are now, and he pointed to his old black truck, and he said, you know what the best option on that truck is? I said, no, what? He said, no payment. Death and destruction, like death and destruction, your desires are never satisfied. That's just human nature because we live in a fallen world. You're never satisfied. Under this sun, in the earth, you're never going to be satisfied if you're chasing things of the earth. So what Solomon is trying to tell you is think about eternal things. Something else Mr. Robert said, and Mr. Robert, was almost a prophet for today, whether he realized it or not. He said he was telling stories about his mom and his childhood and how he grew up, and I started talking about my grandpa who passed away no less than 2 months ago, and he was like, I bet you wish you could talk to him right now. And I said, I do. And he said, well, the only thing I have that I hold on to are memories. And what are memories? Just time spent, right? Time spent with who? With people. So your relationships is something that don't go away. You think when we get to heaven we'll have relationships? I think so. Thankfully, we know. If you're a believer, you know that this stuff under the sun don't matter. Why? Because of Jesus, right? The gospel. Because Jesus paid that price. Somewhere in the New Testament it says Jesus satisfied death once and for all. And because of Jesus, we can have that hope and that peace. If you don't know Jesus today, I'd love to tell you about him. Verse 9 says, 2 people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. How are 2 people better than one? Somebody tell me an example. I figured, I didn't want to put everybody on the spot, so I've got a few examples. I read this morning, actually, how 2 things are better than one. It's easier to run a race. Think if you're running a marathon and you got 2 people instead of 1, you only got to run 13 miles instead of 26 all by yourself. You can relay race, that's better. A horse, a Belgian draft horse, said 1 horse can pull about 8,000 pounds. So you would think 2 horses can pull 16,000 pounds, but they have witnessed 2 horses, Belgian draft horses, pulling up to 22,000 pounds. Fruit bearing, producing stuff. 2 people can produce more than 1 person, right? You can't multiply by 1 person, can you? That's a good thing. Third thing, accountability and encouragement. Whether you know it or not, you need people around you. Because like Solomon, if you're isolated, if you're alone, I am the best person to talk myself into or out of anything. I've said that many times. If I don't have somebody around me, encouraging me, pointing me to God toward eternal things, then this life, which is never satisfied, brings death and destruction. Sooner or later in life, you're going to run into it. Run head first into it. How many of you struggle? How many of you have been through some sort of destruction? How many of you ever been depressed? People say, I've heard people say, the best medicine is water, sunshine, and people. I know most people that deal with any sort of mental health issues, there seems to be a pattern. And I know sometimes there's a chemical imbalance. I'm not saying this is all the time, so if this speaks to you, it does, and if it don't, it don't. But most people with mental health issues, if you look at their life, they're very isolated in some sort of sense. You got to have people around you to encourage you, to spur you along, like Hebrews says, to hold you accountable, because everybody has weaknesses, right? Nobody's perfect. Fourth thing, carry burdens. Two people can carry more than one person can. If you're trying to carry all that stuff along, you'll probably write a book like Ecclesiastes if you were to write one. Jesus, what does he say? Come to me, all who are weary and need rest, for my burden is light and my yoke is easy. I'll give you rest. Verse 10 says, if one person falls, then the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. If you'll notice, verses 10, 11, and 12 give examples to and support what verse 9 says. Likewise, two people lying close together can keep each other warm. If you spend the night outside, you'll figure that one out. If a person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Which speaks to what I just explained. If you're alone, you're in real trouble. Maybe you don't trust people. I had a hard time trusting people, especially people in church. I made excuses, and I've said this plenty of times, and I'll probably say it a few more, but have you ever got a bad haircut? Yeah? Did you stop getting haircuts? You ever ate a bad meal? Did you stop eating? Just because you have a bad experience don't mean you quit. You don't give up on people. And I thank God people didn't give up on me, because I wouldn't be standing up here talking to you today if people were to give up on me. Even when I give up on myself. That's what Solomon's trying to tell you. You're better together. What's something that lasts? Relationships, right? Likewise, two people lying close together can keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? You can't. A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back and conquer. I think about Westerns. You ever watched a Western and they get there in the middle of the town and they get back to back and draw their guns and start going in a circle and they take out the whole town. I love those parts. Somebody got your back. Somebody in your life got your back. If you're married, I hope your wife or your husband's got your back, but sometimes I learned a hard lesson that if you put all that weight on them all the time, you're setting them up for failure. If you put your happiness in them and you put all your burdens on them, like Scott said after he got done singing the song, you cast your cares on Jesus because he cares for you. And some of those things might be misplaced and that you're putting on on your spouse, especially your happiness. That's something God's in charge of. If you put it all on your wife, you're setting her up for failure. And I speak that because I've done it a couple times. And I realized we argued a lot more when I did. And I finally figured out mine or my wife's happiness shouldn't be dependent upon me or her. And if I give that to God, then I can be the one. When she falls, I can help her up. And when I fall, she can help me up because I'm not thinking about if she's making me happy or not, or if I'm making her happy. Three or even better. For a triple braided cord is not easily broken. When me and Chrissy got married, and a lot of times people use this at weddings, and it's applied to marriage, which is a great thing, but it's not only marriage. He's talking about just in general. 3 people are better than 2, and even better than 1. If you're not married, do you got companionship? Do you got friendship? Do you got relationships? When me and Chrissy got married, a lot of times at the wedding, people pour sand or have rings, and it's a circle, never ends. Me and Chrissy had a little easel and a board and 3 ropes nailed to it, and while they were playing the song, we braided the ropes together. And Ecclesiastes 4:12 was a verse. And that thing is framed and up on the wall in our bedroom, and she made it. And I didn't realize it. I knew what it was talking about, but I didn't realize it so much then as much as I do now because I've applied it. But in marriage, it's talking about you and your partner being together. That's great. But if you put God in the middle of it, that's even greater. But not only apply that to marriage, apply that to your friendships, your relationships, your brother, your sister, your family. Put God in the middle of it. 3 people. What's something 3 people can do better than 2? I looked something up on YouTube yesterday morning while my kids were eating breakfast, and there was a pastor and his kids doing this object lesson, and he had water balloons, and he had put a milk jug out in the middle of a field with full of water, and each one of his kids got up there and threw one water balloon, and they all missed. He's like, well, what if we try 2 people? So 2 people threw them and they missed. And he's like, well, what if we do 3 people? And they got a slingshot, and one held one end, one held the other, and the other drew the balloon back, even bigger balloon, and launched it. And they hit the water jug. A triple braided cord is not easily broken. Relationships last. Remember that. Like Bobby said at the greeting, we're intended for relationships. God made us for a relationship. Do you have relationships? What does that mean? What do you have to do to get to know somebody? I say this all the time. How do you get to know somebody? Spend time with them, right? Well, like I said earlier, what do you spend your time on? What do you work for? What's the purpose of all of it? I'm not saying go and quit your job. But if you look at your job as a ministry, which is what ministry is, then I promise you work will have more meaning when you focus more on the people and invest time in that than just acquiring more stuff. Because the fellow that wrote this letter acquired everything you could acquire and got to the end of his life and was like, man, this ain't worth a hill of beans. Do life together. Verse 13 says, "It is better to be a poor but wise youth than an old foolish king who refuses all advice." I don't know if Solomon's talking about himself, but I like to think he is, and that he's got to the end of his life, and he's ruler and king, and they've conquered lands, and he's got all these things and houses and mansions like he talked about at the beginning of the book, and got 1,000 women, and just got everything you could ever imagine. And he realizes he's old and foolish and can't nobody tell him nothing now because he refuses all advice. It's better to be poor but wise. And why? What makes a poor young person wise? Anybody know that? You're willing to listen, right? You're willing to seek counsel. That's part of doing life together. You got somebody in your life that can do that. I've said this before in messages earlier this year. Do you got real friends? I'm not talking about a buddy. I'm not talking about a golf buddy or a drinking buddy, or you got some sort of common denominator, commonality. You have something in common, and that's what brings you together. I mean, do you have a friend that is willing to tell you what you don't want to hear because they care about you? If you don't have friends like that, I promise you, somewhere in this body you can find somebody. And the only thing you got to do is be vulnerable, humble, and ask. Take a step of faith. I know that's hard. It's hard to sacrifice your pride and your ego and say, I suck. I need help. It's hard to do that. I used to put on my bathroom mirror just to remind myself, you're not as good as you think you are. And it reminded me, I need people in my life. Whether you can make all the excuses in the world. You can be a victim and say, well, you haven't had so-and-so happen in your life, and you haven't been through what I've been through. If you keep reading this letter, it'll motivate you to realize that you keep going down that road, and when you get older and you're alone and you realize, what was the purpose of all this? Why do I feel so meaningless, pointless, futile? I think what Solomon's trying to say is life's a struggle, right? We live in a fallen world. It's not too hard to tell that nowadays. If you turn on the news, I'm sure you can get some of it. But you can either struggle alone, because it's going to be a struggle until Jesus comes back, or you can do it together. And if you do it together, there's all these benefits, like we just talked about. You can carry more. You can go further. You can produce more. You have somebody to encourage you. You have somebody to keep you honest and humble. So you can struggle alone or you can struggle together. My challenge to you is just to ask yourself. And if you don't have it figured out, sometimes I have to pray, Lord, my heart ain't right. I don't know how to fix this, and I don't know what to do, and I need your help. And there's sometimes I don't even know what I'm talking about. I just know there's something when I start feeling depressed, and everything in my life can be going right. Like we talked about Wednesday in James, Paul and James complement each other by saying struggle, trials, consider it all joy, because they produce things that last, and God puts those things in your life because He cares for you and He loves you, and He cares more about you growing and maturing and getting closer to Him than He does about your comfortability or your contentment. Do life together. If you read Ephesians, that book's a lot about the body coming together. We all have parts. Did you know God made you unique, special? There's only one John. There's only one John Campbell. There's only one Mr. Alvin. There's only one Greg. And if Greg, John, Mr. Alvin aren't seeking God, seeking things above the sun, and realizing the purpose of life, which is relationships, people, time, then they're not going to be who God made them to be. And that's going to be a part of the body that we're missing. And we're not going to be stronger because of it. And if we don't come together and do life together, we're going to have to keep attracting people with this hand and then trying to tell them about Jesus with this hand. Well, the majority of the time, if we just come together and love on each other, we won't have to come up with all sorts of things to try to attract people to Jesus. Struggle alone or together. It's up to you. Let's pray. God, thank you for the privilege and just opportunity to study your word and to draw closer to you. And thank you for people like Solomon, dear Lord, who went through everything you could go through and under this sun. And thank you for just him pointing us to you, dear Lord, because I have found that when I put my mind on eternal things, dear Lord, all the circumstances in my life it isn't as heavy a burden to carry, and they don't matter so much. And when I put my faith and trust in you, dear Lord, I have this peace, dear Lord, that the world can't explain. God, I pray that wherever anybody is, that they would just have the faith and be willing to ask you. I pray that they would figure out the meaning of their life, the purpose of their life, and know that when they put it toward eternal things, all the stuff in this world just kind of fades away, and it brings this joy and this peace that gets you excited about your ministry, your job. It gets you excited about the people you put in our life, dear Lord. And it changes lives. It changed my life. And God, I just thank you for it. Love you. Amen.